things going on campus that it's hard to decide what to attend, but very much appreciate your being here for our annual meeting. Our meeting is in two parts. Basically, we have a guest speaker, which will be the first part. We'll take a short break. We have like refreshments over here, so that I hope you'll avail yourself of them. And then we'll go into the second part of the meeting. After the talk, we will invite your questions, discussion, whatever, for however long it goes. I've asked Franklin to speak about 35 or 40 minutes and then leave it open for discussion after that point. I'd like to cut it off about 1:55, have a very brief refreshment break, and then reassemble for the rest of the program, which is more or less the business portion. So at this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. He is a doctor of education. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Army National Guard, serving on active duty for the National Guard Bureau in Washington, D.C. He is a veteran of Operation Iraq Freedom. More to our interest today, he's a military historian, educational theorist, and a philosopher who has done extensive research and writes about our founder, Alden Partridge. I think we'll learn something that we didn't know about our founder. So at this time, I'd like to welcome.
Thank you. So it's really my honor to be here in Norwich, and especially talking about Captain Alden Partridge. And my goal here today is just to tell you a few of the dozens of ideas he had, and really tell you the relevance of those ideas into the 21st century. And when we think about Alden Partridge, hopefully we think him more than just a founder of this fine institution, but one that we should really consider re-examining his ideas and reincorporating his ideas of an American model of education, specifically either at the university level or even his theories on primary and secondary education, because they are dramatically different than what we use today. So as I was introduced, I hold a doctorate degree from North Central University. When I was studying for my doctorate degree, I was writing on Army self-development. I found myself as an ROTC instructor when cadets asked me what they could do for self-development to improve themselves. I realized that I was always defaulting to some type of institutional training. So I was telling them to go to Ranger School or Airborne School or Air Assault School to work on these various aspects of their leadership. But if you understand the model, self-development is all the stuff you do in the Army outside of what they tell you to do. So at that point, I really started researching very deeply into how do we encourage soldiers to go out and basically teach themselves. How do we encourage them and make them love learning so that we don't have to actually direct their learning? They're always out there constantly trying to improve themselves. And I only really found two major philosophers talking about that. The first one was the Marine Corps Charles Krulak, fairly recently, and then before that was Captain Alden Partridge talking about the use of motivation and not compromising motivation. But it was so radical, his ideas on not compromising motivation, it just absolutely shocked me that we weren't discussing him everywhere, whether it was in just basic curriculum of education theory, because he was predicting kind of ideas, thoughts that we wouldn't rediscover until really the 1970s. So how could a guy in 1820 know all of this, be inside the institutional knowledge, and yet be sitting there with these great ideas totally ignored in history? So he kind of became a pet project to me, and then later I just discovered kind of his conflicts at West Point and kind of why we don't remember him. But that really sparked my interest in him to try to resurrect him from obscurity, or just being a statue on the wall, or just something we say for recruiting purposes. I have studied, so in education, I have a master's degree in military history, where I research more of his connections, or Partridge's connections on Stoic philosophy. I run a YouTube channel, but I haven't been very active on that, but I share my educational theories on that when I'm not in the middle of writing the book. And I got scolded a couple weeks ago for not telling everyone I'm a medical service corps officer. currently serving in the Nebraska National Guard, assigned to Arlington, and none of the stuff I say here will be Department of Defense approved. So I have to put a disclaimer in there that this is far too radical to be official policy for the Army. I invite everyone to go on Google and type in Captain Alden Partridge Lecture on Education and read through it. It's something like 12 type pages, but it's probably one of the most beautifully written education theories that have ever been penned. It consolidates a huge amount of philosophers that came before Partridge, and Partridge added a significant amount to that document. He recalls kind of all the major areas he thinks that college education is failing. He would have written this about 1820 to 1825 period. All the areas he points out as a direct failure of the American education system still exist today. All the solutions that he proposed to fix that could be applied today. So I can't go through the dozens of points that he brings out in this lecture, but I will highlight about 4 of them to make it kind of immediately clear that he still has application in the modern era. I'm not a biographer in the classical sense. If you're trying to kind of get a list of what's happened in Partridge's life, I would check out Ellis. The library holds copies of the history of Norwich that kind of goes through his achievements and the different types of academies he established. But just in short, he's a son of a revolutionary soldier. He is in that interesting generation where the founding fathers kind of set the vision for America, and then his generation had to figure out how do we actually make that vision or that philosophy come to life. So that's kind of the era that he's sitting in. I went to Dartmouth for a few years before moving to West Point. Graduates West Point within 9 months of being there. He's such an exceptional cadet at West Point. He's commissioned as a first lieutenant. He's only one of 2 men to ever get appointed at that rank. He goes on to immediately start serving on faculty, and he is kind of truly responsible for West Point surviving the War of 1812. When the war comes, every other officer is tasked out to the field for field service, and then he alone ends up teaching multiple different domains of that academy while fighting against a very hostile staff that wants to convert the United States Military Academy into a civilian institution. A whole bunch of drama ensues, and then ultimately he'll leave that academy in 1817 and go start Norwich and his various different other military academies. He played a key role in the establishment of the land-grant colleges. He was the first person to propose land grants to the states in Congress. His proposal for land grants were very much in his model, so students would study a wide range of education. They wouldn't have like traditional or typical masters or majors as we think of majors of today. Very broadly taught. And one of the major things he would propose is scientific study of agriculture and make sure that American environment is safeguarded and protected because the fertility of American soil is critical for our survival as a nation. And really that still remains today. Founded the first private military academy in Norwich, which became Norwich, and he sparked a national movement for private military academies. So every private military academy in the United States, in one way or other, is connected to Partridge, or at least owes their existence to Partridge, including institutions where he wasn't directly involved in founding. He would write articles or newspaper clippings in support. So, for example, VMI, he wrote a series of articles that were published throughout Virginia that helped that institution gain support. He was actually the one that suggested VMI to become an engineering college, and that's one of the reasons why ultimately VMI was founded as an engineering institution. The reason why we don't remember him is his vision of an American system of education ultimately conflicted with the French Napoleonic model of a professional standing military army. Individuals like Monroe wanted to import kind of the foreign European model because they thought that Napoleon's army was undefeatable. Instead of trusting Americans to develop an education system for a republic, we ended up adapting a military system for a monarchy, which is a tragedy. His history has been obscured. for two reasons. Number one, official military historians tried to hide Partridge because he basically proved that the U.S. Military Academy wasn't constitutionally founded. The Constitution never gave the authority for the funding of West Point and its continuation. And by the time he had established his military academies, he proved that there was a more democratic way of producing equally, if not better, qualified officers than the military academy. So the military academy historians basically went after his legacy and tried to write him out of history. And then that perpetuates the modern day, because I think what happens is we have a historical bias. So if all the original historians from West Point said that Partridge was a bumbling idiot, then you just take it on face value that it must be true because the official history said so. So there's never been a correction or clarification looking back in time. Additionally, the civilian academic community kind of has a belief that if we teach people to stop fighting with each other, then wars will just kind of disappear and become archaic. We'll never fight a war ever again. So if we don't talk about Partridge and his requirement that everyone learns kind of military tactics, then we never have to deal with that again. So both on the official military side and on the civilian academic side, you had historians that basically purposely ignored Partridge. If I was going to look for a beautiful summary of Partridge's education model, I'd actually look to Ralph Waldo Emerson. This was written a number of years, 9 years after Partridge's death, and it's almost certain that Partridge and Emerson knew of each other. Emerson historians don't recall that he had any interaction with Partridge, but they were on very similar speaking tours. And the year of 1863, Emerson was asked to go up to West Point and be on the board of visitors, and he would have seen a lot of the educational techniques put into practice by Partridge. But notable aspect here is this was written inside the American Civil War, and you see Emerson, instead of his earlier works, The American Scholar, which a lot of people know, you see him pick up the aspect that it's the duty of college students to be trained and to be fully armed men. And you see the various aspects of Partridgean theory come out in this that was not present in the earlier works of Emerson. So specifically that they were Stoics. So they were men that used the Stoic philosophy, and more importantly, they had a responsibility to their community, formidable, athletic. They treasured their youth, so they took advantage of the time they had. They were very mindful for their time. They didn't engage in needless luxury, and importantly, they were capable of arming and defending themselves. Ultimately, Emerson would accuse American professors as playing a large part into starting the American Civil War because he said they betrayed the trust of the nation in terms of they didn't stand up for virtue, they didn't stand up for capitalism, and that they turned away from the historical values of what was America. So one notable aspect about Partridge's education theory that most people are never introduced with in the modern society, kind of from the 1880s, our American education system's really been dominated by progressive education theories. So to the point where to study kind of Renaissance or Enlightenment theories on education, you almost have to go back, I think I had to go back to at least 1910 to find clear representations of what the theories were honestly like inside American history. So we, by and large, we as in the academic education community, have just been not teaching people that this theory exists. If I said a person was a Renaissance man, most of us would understand what that means. A person that has a broad level of skills, very talented, they can do multiple things, they're very artistic and creative. Well, what Partridge was doing was really borrowing from a Renaissance or Enlightenment theory that says men or citizens should be trained kind of across the spectrum of anything they may be asked to do as a citizen of the Republic. So, and that's both in War and Peace. John Milton and John Locke primarily were the dominant influences on American education at the very beginning of our republic, and up until about the 1880s, they were the dominant force in education. And if you look at the works of John Milton and look at the works of Alden Partridge, they very much mirror themselves in the fact that the intent was to train a Norwich grad that no matter where that Norwich grad sits in society, no matter what they might be asked to do in a social role, that they would have skills and ability to manage and be a useful person in that capacity. I'm going to use the term polymathic. We have developed our society to be very monomathic, or very specialist in nature in terms of how we go about skills. So we have majors now. We've kind of endured the industrial model, so we think the best way of educating people is to teach them to be highly skilled in one area, and that basically locks them into only the creativity of that one single part. Where Partridge's model would expect students to study across a very broad range of knowledge, and you wouldn't have what we traditionally think of as a major. So the ideas or areas where Partridge would propose were basically universal expectations. So Norwich wasn't a school that had an engineering major and a school that had an agriculture major and a school that had a philosophy major. It was every student was going to go through and learn all the various subjects of kind of being a man of letters. And Partridge, even though he exists kind of at the front forward edge of the Industrial Revolution, he did not kind of adapt the monomathic influences of the Industrial Revolution that we see today. If anyone has any time, and there's any great historians, maybe one of the cadets sitting here one day, someone needs to write a historical fiction about Partridge meeting Alexis de Tocqueville and what would have happened if Partridge's ideas would have been broadcast around the world. Tocqueville was a French diplomat that came to America to study the American prison systems, but he wrote a book in 2 volumes called Democracy in America. It is probably the finest work of political theory in the 19th century. I encourage everyone to take a look at it because the changes in American society have been incredibly radical since that book has been written. We are far less involved in our communities than we ever have before, and it's a shame, and I wish that we could get back to the level of civic engagement that Tocqueville wrote about. But Tocqueville had a powerful warning saying, hey, the more we make people specialized in making individual widgets, the less they learn the mastery of the whole entire unit. So even though we're making good people be really good at making widgets, we're losing the masters that can make the whole entire component. So we're limiting the intellectual capacity of our workers as they're getting more and more skilled making individual aspects of whatever the project is. And while we tend to think that the more specialized you get, the higher companies are going to pay you, and it's going to protect you if you're hyper-specialized, the upper edge of that specialization is actually harmful for employees, because if you get super good at making one single widget for whatever, a Ford truck, well, maybe that Chevy truck doesn't have that widget, so it's not like you're demanding all sorts of money because there's a market demand for your skills. It's because those widgets have become so specialized they're not interchangeable, so other companies aren't seeking you out to kind of steal that ability to make the widget. So I think we do face a culture that's in danger of becoming over-specialized, and in a way that we're actually harming the kind of career capacity of our students to move from one field into another. And there's really a question of, we have a German-based model of education that's still based on an industrial world, but we're long past an industrial model. So then the question is, why are we still educating people the way we are? On average, it takes about 7 years to produce a textbook. So you think about whatever cutting-edge research, by the time we train kind of a student in IT, whatever we just taught them inside a 4-year academy is irrelevant and obsolete by the time they go into the workforce. So we really have to challenge our ideas about what is college, what information needs to be taught into college. And unfortunately, our education has shifted a lot towards credentialism. So we now, today, use a degree more as a social marker. So if I'm a recruiter and I'm looking at job resumes, the fastest way to cut down to a smaller pool of resumes is I search to see who has a bachelor's degree. It doesn't matter how good your bachelor's degree is, we just need a bachelor's. Now it's coming to the point where you're just searching for a master's degree. It's not really that those people have learned so much more and acquired so much more in their education. It's just a different level of social marker. And to some degrees, it's protectionism, where certain careers have required certain types of degrees so they can artificially increase the demand on their profits. And the test of credentialism is really, if I asked, this would be an interesting experiment. If you ask, whatever, we'll use Harvard instead of Norwich, right? If I said, you could go to Harvard absolutely free, get personalized instruction from every instructor, but you'll never graduate from Harvard, that's option one. Or you could have a Harvard degree today and never sit in a class, which one would you pick? I'd be hard-pressed if I didn't find most students say, I want the degree, because I want the credentials. I don't care about the education. And that's kind of the shame that our college system is moving in that direction, and we're losing the intrinsic value of what students would gain by being on campuses. It's really hurting us inside the military that we've developed a really COG, or industrial model approach to developmental people. So we think that, hey, this is a young cadet who's going to be commissioned. I need to send him through OBC, maybe captain's career course. Maybe I need to send him to the Ranger School, and then he's going to perform exactly the same way as the next cadet over that gets put in that assignment, provided they go through the exact same educational widgets. And that's not actually what happens. Human interaction, communities play a lot more in terms of our human flourishing, and if we continue to treat people kind of as widgets or machines where they have to go through very specific experiences, we're not actually going after traits or developing certain skill sets. We're just collecting these credential markers as we go along. So what did Partridge have envisioned? This was a letter that he wrote when he was trying to establish a military academy in Pennsylvania. But essentially Partridge said, hey, in my model, I'm going to be able to produce students that are at least as good of lawyers as what you're using in your classical seminaries. But unlike your classical seminaries, my students will actually know how to do drill and ceremonies and march and do military tactics. So if a militia company gets formed in their town, they can become the commanding officer, the captain of that militia. Not only that, if they have a neighbor that has a farm that needs his farm surveyed, that when he's not being a lawyer, he could go out and he could survey that farm, make some more money. Hey, that farmer trusts him doing the survey, so maybe that gets out that he's a good surveyor. So when the next time a town needs a road or a railroad or a canal built, they might call on that same individual saying, hey, can you help us do this engineering project as well? So essentially, he wanted to make a graduate that not only was capable of holding down kind of a career job, but they were infinitely capable to help their society in other types of ways. And they could profit off of that, both by helping their community and, making the extra money through these various different endeavors that they had learned going through Norwich, or his model of education, I should say. So motivation, this was the kind of key thing that really sparked my interest in Partridge, and he used the example of Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal is a really interesting example in history. He was an 18th century French mathematics kind of genius. His father wanted him to have a classical education, so when he was very young, he prohibited his son from learning mathematics. He wanted him just to strictly focus on learning Greek and Latin, because that was like the first major challenges of getting a classical education. Well, they discovered Blaise, I think at the age of 6 or 7, with chalk on his nursery floor, actually doing geometry, advanced level geometry. Like, he didn't know what a circle was, but he called it a round, and he figured out what the ratio of pi was, and he figured out all these mathematical formulas all by himself, being totally left alone. So he was an absolute mathematical genius, and at that point his father realized, I don't want my son to learn Latin or Greek, I will just let him be a mathematical genius. He would go on to invent the third mechanical calculator of all time. His father was a tax collector in France, and he would have to go out to various farmers and collect taxes. Well, it was very complicated to figure out taxes, right? Like, we'd have a projected yield on the farm, but maybe you had a drought, or maybe you made more crops than expected. So adapting that tax on the fly was almost impossible until Blaise figured out a way to make a calculator to do that. So he dramatically helped his father. But the moral of the story is Partridge's education model was infinitely flexible in the sense that if he recognized the student absolutely hated the subject, Partridge would say, don't teach them that subject. Like, the worst thing you can do is force a student into an area that they have no interest in and aversion to, because what you'll do is you'll pressure them to the point where they'll learn that learning isn't fun, and they don't want to do it. So, and I'm sure most of us in this room could think of one college class that they took in college that, that was a barrier, or even my own example. Like, I never made it through whatever German, the last 2 semesters of German, so I never finished my degree in philosophy. If we allowed students to, if they had aversions to one area, just basically excel in another, and then their graduate certificate, and explain like where their weaknesses, where their strengths were, we could produce learners that when they left institutions would continue their learning, instead of saying, oh, I'm done with whatever, my bachelor's or master's, I never want to read another book. And it was really until Malcolm Knowles, which is considered the father of adult education, and the 1960s and 70s, that came out and basically said the same thing as what Partridge said, is, hey, if you are a proactive learner and can direct your own learning, you're going to retain more, you're going to learn more, and you're just going to have a better experience versus someone being forced into an area that they don't want to learn. So if you can maximize that aspect. So in a sense, Partridge's education model is both more broad, but it allowed the flexibility. Is if you had that one child savant that was a beautiful musician, then you would allow them to come into your university and study until what we think now is a doctorate level of music, and then at that point you could issue them a degree as a bachelor's and they could go on their way in society. So graduation in Partridge's model was really when a student could demonstrate enough theoretical knowledge or practical skills in a broad range of education, and it's just whenever you hit that threshold is when you could graduate out of the institution. So what is not normally recognized inside Partridge's theory is his use of Stoic ethics. Partridge never, in any of his writings, have I ever found him saying specifically to go out and be a Stoic. However, the founding fathers were so embedded into this philosophy, I think that a lot of Partridge's references to American, or what it means to be American, is actually a reference into Stoic ethics. But without a doubt, Norwich was founded on top of Stoic ethics. I'll show you in a few seconds. But what it is Stoic ethics is really a virtue-driven philosophy developed in ancient Greek. Most of what we know of Stoicism now comes from the later Roman emperors, or Roman Empire. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote the Meditations, one of the major books. Epictetus and Seneca are also major writers. But the Stoics, when they founded their philosophy, they absorbed a lot of the Spartan military practices because they realized that Spartans were using these practices to drive military excellence, but Stoics could use those same practices to drive moral excellence. And it's kind of interesting. If you think of a Greek philosopher, you typically think of the old guy with the beard wrapped in a gray cloak. Well, that gray cloak is actually the attire of a Spartan officer. Anybody know that? So the original Stoics, original philosophers from Socrates, were actually wearing the attire of the Spartans, and sometimes they were misunderstood to be Spartans when they're really Stoics. If you go through the history books and count the amount of historians that will call Partridge a Spartan, you'll find dozens of cases where he's constantly referred to as a Spartan, and I think he was really, truly a Stoic. Stoic had a tremendous influence on the founding fathers, which I'll get into. Montesquieu, who influenced our structure of our government, talked about really the Stoics above all believed that mankind was born for the purpose of serving other men. So if we think about it, if you saw a wolf pup being born in nature, like all of us would agree, hey, that the purpose of that wolf is to make sure that that pack thrives and does well and continues on. But for some odd reason, in the last probably 150 years, we think, well, if a little baby is born, we will debate whether that human child has any duty to fulfill anything in their society or has any obligation to their fellow man, which seems insane, but a lot of our modern philosophy is all debating an issue that would have been accepted by the ancients. I listed just a few of the Stoic influence texts that Partridge used, but the writings of Virgil, Cicero, Tacitus, Butler, Plutarch, Locke, I could go on. Daniel Defoe also was heavily influenced. The founding fathers were incredibly influenced by the Stoics and the Neo-Stoics. The Neo-Stoics being Justus Lipsius, he adapted Stoic philosophy with Christian theology. He was very critical, kind of this 16th century with the rise of linear tactics and firearms. What we think of just law theory actually comes out of Neo-Stoicism. Thomas Jefferson claimed to be an Epicurean, but if you actually look at most of his personal life philosophy, it actually derives from Stoics. If I could assign one book to every cadet of Norwich, it would be this one. Rome's Last Citizen tells the story of Cato the Younger. Cato the Younger was the last of the Roman senators that stood in defiance against Julius Caesar in defense of the Roman Emperor or Roman Empire. He ultimately gets defeated and tries to commit suicide. That way he's not used as a political pawn by Julius Caesar. He survives the suicide. He wakes up to find that someone has stitched up his stomach, that he stabbed himself with a sword, and he physically basically rips his stomach out and disembowels himself to make sure that he dies in defiance of Julius Caesar. In the darkest days of the American army at Valley Forge, George Washington had a play that was written by Joseph Addison on that event. He played that for his officer corps. And the intent was to say, hey, to be American means that you're going to be willing to fight to your death to defend the Republic. And that was enough of a message to rally the officers, Army officers at Valley Forge to go on and fight for the American Republic. An incredibly important story in the American tradition that would have been taught to every Norwich man that unfortunately I think after the 1960s got lost out of the curriculum. It should probably be restored. A lot of famous quotes come out from the Founding Fathers, come out from Joseph Addison's play. I regret I have but one life to give for my country is just them stealing lines out of this play. So a lot of the verses that we think of as famous phrases from our Founding Fathers actually relate back to this story. Samuel Adams one day had a desire to turn Boston into a Christian Sparta, which is basically saying, hey, I want Neo-Stoicism to appear inside our culture. So out of this context, when Partridge built his education model, he was working entirely inside this philosophy. Even though Partridge had died basically 2 generations before the Norwich Creed was written, a lot of Stoicism is still captured inside the Norwich Man's Creed. So Flint will list 3 of the 4 Stoic virtues. He replaced justice with honesty. I don't know if that was just him slipping by the side of the lake or if he did that intentionally. There's a phrase on the gate as you come into Norwich, obedience to the law is liberty. That comes from a 6th century Roman philosopher and martyr, Prometheus, very heavily influenced by Stoicism. The fact that we depend on the citizen soldiery comes out of the theorist of Justus Lipsius, which basically means that, hey, mercenary armies, when you hire them, can't be trusted in your own country because they're going to do awful things to your citizens. So it's miserable having a standing or mercenary army. So it's far better to have a militia system because if you activated the militia are from that community. So they're not going to run amok and rape the women or steal things. So that's where the construct of a militia comes from. You see the phrase thoughts, words, and deeds is lifted directly out of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced by the Stoic work of Seneca as well. So this philosophy exists in the history and was intended to be kind of the background work or worldview of Norwichmen. This dovetails nicely into the concept of using physical fitness to build psychological resilience. So Partridge recommended that people go out and walk, 10 miles a day at 4 miles an hour, and then once a quarter you're supposed to go out and walk 30 to 80 miles a day and go measure the elevation of the mountains. And if you do that, you'll develop a strong constitution. I haven't gotten that far. I made it to 62 miles a day. That's the best I can copy so far. Partridge also would develop his cadets to march with ease 40 miles a day. quite an achievement. I don't think anyone marches anywhere close. If you look at the modern military, no one's marching anywhere near 40 miles a day. But this relates to an ancient Stoic practice called Stoic toughtening training, or what we now call Stoic toughtening training. It's basically to go out and engage into an activity until it becomes uncomfortable. And you're supposed to spend a long time enduring this discomfort, so you basically build up your resiliency and you have a frame of reference. So the next time, well, this is one of those things where, like, before I got to Iraq and I had to be on alert for 32 hours, I wish someone would have taken me out and done a 50-mile march. Because at least then I would have had something in my background, in my mind, saying, well, at least this isn't as hard as that one ruck march I went on. But it's interesting that now, so before Operational Stress Program, that's me marching with their team as the last Bataan Memorial Death March, they've been doing studies and they found out, hey, if you reintroduce Stoic philosophy to the public service industry, so police, military, fire, you actually can decrease PTSD, you can increase kind of quality of life of those individuals. They're working on reintroducing it into the military, but Partridge used to have a fully fleshed out psychological resiliency program in his institutions that is totally missing from every military service currently. So here he is, a couple hundred years, again, hundreds of years in advance of the future. While this might not be true at Norwich, across the country we are deteriorating as a society physically and mentally. The shocking part is that graphic that I found is like 10 years out of date. But as of 2021, 44% of college students are overweight. Most colleges will spend less than 3% of their college curriculum on being healthy. Both our primary and secondary education is absolutely failing on producing a healthy citizenry, and it's something that will become a huge crisis for us in terms of medical costs in the coming future. Because we're not teaching the correct ways of framing thoughts and ideas and experience, most of our college, the vast majority of our college students will encounter stress in a way that they can't handle, and they'll need help. And right now, we're not giving them the tools or worldview to correct the issues. Again, this kind of is a symptom of that monomastic or industrial model of education where we shifted and cut down fields in a way that they weren't supposed to be cut down. But if you actually go back to the most effective treatments in psychology, so cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavioral therapy, those were therapies actually with their creators actually went back to Stoic philosophy to build their psychological resilience or psychological protocols. So, we may in our modern times think that we're so advanced because we have this new shiny field of psychology, but the ancient Greeks knew psychology. They just didn't call it psychology. They called it philosophy. So I'd love to see the return of that worldview and that experience, or when your cadets are out marching or doing physical fitness, that they're being told that this isn't just a matter of making you physically stronger, or making sure that you can run a certain distance, but this is to make you uncomfortable, so you learn that it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be outside for long periods of time and to get adapted into your environment. The other thing Partridge did is he did his best to avoid luxury. Once again, this was something the Stoics did very heavily. Partridge forbid feather beds in his academy. So, hey, you have to live like a soldier while you're here at the academy. There's an old rumor that was slandered saying that Partridge hated horses, feather beds, and women. The last one being slandered. Eventually they did get married. He was actually a good horseman by all record too. He just preferred to walk, like Cato the Younger. We use a lot of things in our lives mainly because we've been given them and we have them in our society. It's not that we actually need them. And until we actually have those things removed, we don't realize whether or not we need them or not. During Partridge's era, Norwich cadets really lived like they were soldiers on campaign. So they drank water and they drank coffee. That was basically it. They would eat like a soldier ate. They got meat, vegetables, bread, but they wouldn't have kind of luxuries, which is striking now because the other day I saw a rook drinking a Red Bull upstairs, and all I can think of is like Partridge was furious. Partridge thought that lemonade was like a gateway drug to bad behavior. Very, very good article. I'll have to wait until the archives to get that online. But Partridge created a kind of a model of democracy where he could pull students together in poverty. So he was pulling in cadets from maybe rich planter families in the South, or maybe he pulled in, whatever, Ransom came in as a poor student that was just on a musical scholarship. They all wear the same uniform. They all got the same food. They weren't allowed to have pocket money. Every cadet had the same experience, so you basically ensured that the Republic got trained together, that we wouldn't develop a class-based system. So they learned from their students that everyone was equal, no one could buy themselves extra wealth, extra comfort, and it really increased kind of the communications between what we think of as rich and poor today, which we should think about doing it. But his model of education also drastically reduced the cost of education. One of the reasons why he put soldiers or cadets in uniform is uniforms are cheaper than the civilian hire today. This should be striking to everyone. So Partridge allowed students to go through his program as fast as they could. It could be as little as 1 year. So if we take Partridge's tuition and adjust it for inflation, a 4-year degree from Partridge, which would be above average length of time, 3 years was the average, would be somewhere around $49,000. And you could graduate for as little as $8,000. If you came in, you're highly motivated to study, you got good, and you got going. The current class of 2028 is facing $209,000 in tuition costs, and then the question is, are we really offering anything better than what Partridge would have offered, especially at over 4 times the cost? Not only is it a cost financially in debt and loans, it's also a cost in time. We artificially set up and say, you must spend 4 years here. If Partridge allowed his students to accelerate, how much does it cost to regain 1 more year of a career? How much money is 1 year's wages worth times interest over a career? So significant difference in cost. And I think right now we're kind of really facing trouble is there's a huge amount of tuition. College tuition is increasing at unsustainable levels. That's increasing at, student debt is increasing, becoming a huge bubble for us. $1.6 trillion out there. Almost 43 million Americans are carrying debt from school. And colleges are in a race to see who can spend more money. The problem is we have a federal student loan program that guarantees that students are worth a certain percentage of money. So colleges know exactly what they can ask for. Well, every year those colleges are stretching how much money they're asking for, and then Congress is responding by giving them bigger loans. So there's no incentive for the colleges to stop. And if you're going to be attractive to someone, you need to be fancier to recruit students to your college versus someone else's. So I remember before the federal student loan existed in 1998, when I walked in my first semester at University of Nebraska, Omaha, they had a workout bench that the headdress was duct taped, and it was just black, and it was just iron weights. But now if you walk into that same gym, it's like interior design, mine's state-of-the-art workout equipment, branded weights, weights that have university logos. This really costs. It actually adds nothing to the value of a student's education, where that old bench press that was duct taped together would have worked for 95% of the students. So unless we figure out a way to control the luxuries, and more importantly, we need to teach students to live without the luxuries and live without that standard of living, so by the time they leave college, they know how to be poor and how to live roughly when they don't have an income within their means. We're going to sell those individuals into constant debt that they're never going to escape from, and that impacts all sorts of things in life, whether it's retirement or ability to buy houses into the future. So time. Partridge is very sensitive in the use of time. I ran his schools very much like a monastery in terms of everything was packed, in terms of what cadets would go throughout the day, and it was basically 16 hours of organized time that they're going to do things. Because their whole point of being in college was to get through college. It wasn't finding themselves or doing other things. It was physical training, it was studying, it was practical skills, agriculture, learning skills. But the moral of the story is, if we look at the Stoics, time in our modern society, like we would notice if someone came up to us and basically took $5 from us and walked away. But we'll entertain things, or we'll look at whatever Facebook or Twitter or whatever else. We'll stare into a phone mindlessly, not thinking about all the value that we just lost because we're basically engaging in mindless entertainment that doesn't have any practical skill. So Partridge was very focused on teaching his men, or teaching his cadets, to focus on time. And that was one of the reasons why he disliked any preset form of tuition where it was like, this is a 4-year degree program, because Partridge would say, hey, if you're aiming for the average length of time for completion, you're putting your good students on a sluggard's path, right? If you can come in and you can prove that you've learned the same amount of stuff in 1 year versus 3 years, you should be able to graduate in 1 year, only pay 1 year of tuition, and be on your way to being productive citizens. Which really taught his students to incentivize productivity. There's a great quote, and I couldn't find it, but in World War II, one of the major generals of the U.S. Army said that Norwich men were very sensitive of being good and being gone. Like Norwich men of the World War II generation were more time-focused than any other officers inside the U.S. Army. So the moral of the story is, hey, the purpose of education is to get through it as quickly as you possibly can to be a productive member of society. In the 20th century, we've created this concept of adolescence that never existed before. So if we go back to our founding father there, is we had men that were as young as 14 that assumed command of warships. And you could have teenagers that were 13 or 14 years go off and start their own farms. But now we have this extended period of childhood that is going to harm us in our society. Well, I think now you can be up at 26 and still be on your parents' insurance. There's this constant thing where, hey, I graduate high school, I take my time, 4 or 5 years to get through bachelor's, and maybe I start a master's before I actually get out into the real world and start working. And we're harming citizens by doing that. The last point I have for you, which is pretty easy to tell for this audience, is Partridge intended military to be a pendium of education. He believed that was the best way to go upon making physically fit men. I believed it to be a safer method than the gymnastics of the era. But he also believed there was a critical role of a citizen to know how to be a militiaman. And he'll actually reference Sparta when the sense is that Sparta without walls was more formidable than Sparta with walls. And for those that don't know Greek and Roman history, Athens built walls around the city to help defend itself when the Spartans made it a point to ensure that their Spartans' warriors were always strong enough that they never had to depend on the fortification to defend their cities. And it was only when the Spartans stopped kind of practicing the military arts or being as rigorous, it was only during that period that the Spartans collapsed. So here's a side question for you. I don't know if anyone would know this. So there's two great Greek empires, right? There's Spartans and Athens. And the founding fathers preferred one, which was Sparta. Does anyone know why they preferred Sparta? So Sparta actually had a constitution that required the betterment of individuals. So Sparta shaped their economy to try to get people to be more virtuous. They made it a law saying that you had to self-develop and improve yourself, or you could be found guilty of breaking that law. So it wasn't that our founding fathers thought that Sparta was stronger than Athens. Actually, Sparta didn't win any more military conflicts than Athens. It's just Sparta attempted to create a virtuous society by their constitution. Now, as we try to introduce military arts and sciences universally, a lot of the first objection I get is, hey, you're supporting militism, which is the strong use of a nation's empire and the use of a military to enforce your will on others. Well, that's what we have today. We have militarism. Around the globe, we're doing that every day. There's nothing that stops us. And it was actually written by a West Point chaplain so beautifully, is what we're trying to do is teach militancy. So I will teach you how to be a militiaman. I will teach you how to be good at war so you don't have to do it. Like the whole point of Norwich is really to make students hate war and realize what a constant burden war is. And some of the things that Partridge wanted to do is he wanted to ensure that the United States was geared to be a peaceful nation and not to bear the debt of a large standing army. Like we are being consumed by our national debt. A lot of it is caused by just an uncontrolled military-industrial complex that we have to deal with. Large militaries threaten societies. Our founding fathers knew that. That's why in the Constitution you raise an army, you don't maintain it. And Partridge was really interesting that he extended not only military knowledge, but a lot of knowledge to women as well. So all his lectures, all the way back to the 1820s, were open for women to be in attendance. This is a great example. There was some kind of anti-war protests that happened on Norwich in 1926. There were flyers that went around campus, and I thought this was probably the most beautiful response for someone that says we shouldn't learn about the military. And it basically says, hey, doctors that go study medicine don't study medicine because they like pain. They want to try to end it. So the whole purpose of ROTC, or the whole purpose of learning how to be a militiaman, is to prevent us from going out and doing this. And we should be wise enough to only use it when we need it. And being prepared is obviously better than not being prepared at all. And there are definitely examples in the 21st century where it's too late to train a militia. So, hey, the Ukrainians passed out military arms right before Russia invaded. What's the use of handing out a machine gun to a person that doesn't understand how to be an infantryman? So, if they would have had a culture that would have trained their college graduates on, just basic level tactics, then their militia could have been a threat. Israel had a trained militia system. They just didn't allow them to keep more than 50 rounds of ammunition. So all of a sudden they had an army, plop down from out of the sky, and, fighting an army with 50 rounds of ammunition is not a good place to be. So there are some reasons to go back to the use of universal military education. One of the most interesting studies I ran across was a study of the conflicts between Native Americans and kind of colonialists, and went from the colonial era up through the Indian War, so after the American Civil War. And what they found is essentially when farmers were part of the militia, they were far more likely to engage in trade or negotiation or settlements or some type of other negotiations and hostilities. But after the Civil War, and when we started stationing active duty cavalry units in the West, and the farmers that had no threat of being called to war were very, very inclined to tell the local cavalrymen to go fight the Indians. So you saw almost, or even more than twice the violence once you removed the obligation for military service off the farmers. So that should tell us, like, hey, having a standing army is making us more violent, and we're not individually taking that in mind when we're voting. And really, it goes down to voting. There was a study done about a decade ago. I really wish I could find it. I couldn't. A scholar went into major cities and tried to interview people within the height kind of the long war, Iraq, Afghanistan. He was asking random citizens to name a single person that served in the military. And like 98% of the people couldn't even name a person. So then you're like, well, if 98% of the people that he's engaging with doesn't have any type of connection to the military, are they thinking about going to war or the military or the use of military when they're casting their votes? Like, we are compromising our democracy by not teaching the skill to students and really teaching them the horrors of war, the hardships of war, the realities of war, so that they vote to keep us a more peaceful nation. Interestingly enough, the Burrell Land-Grant Act has a clause that says, and military tactics in it. It was an expectation that every land-grant college would teach military tactics. The way that Partridge would interpret it would be that's a universal requirement. Now the land-grant colleges just interpret that to say that only a tiny minority have to do that. All we have to do is offer ROTC. It's not a requirement, but we should really ask ourselves as a citizen, what is an educated man or woman of letters in our modern society? Like, everyone, I'm sure, that has a college degree was asked to write a poem sometime in their college degree to graduate. But like, war is an integral part of human society, but yet we're not asked to engage in any shape, way, or form. We're never asked to carry a rucksack. We're never asked to go, live like a soldier for 3 days or eat rations or become uncomfortable like a soldier. But we should really say, hey, to be an educated man, or man or woman, that should be a component of our education. So just to wrap things up, I can say that every problem that Partridge identified in his lecture of education still exists today. Unfortunately, a lot of them exist to some shape or fashion inside Norwich itself, which is a shame. Partridge's model is superior to our conventional model of education in dozens of ways that I didn't even get a chance to touch on. And the real question remains is, are we going to go back to Norwich, or to Partridge, take a look at his ideas and reincorporate kind of an American system of education for our American Republic? Or are we going to continue to use a German system that isn't supportive of our very governmental system? So, thank you.
Wow, covered a lot of territory. We have a few minutes for questions, and then I would ask Franklin to remain here, maybe in the lobby. You can approach him and have a conversation with him. But at this time, let me ask if there are any reactions or questions.
This isn't an important question to your study, but on one of your slides, you were talking about the Death March. Is that white stands?
Yes.
My son was basically
Okay.
the house.
Yeah.
Adrian Diaz, class of 10, there was a point of discussion about West Point historians or Army historians and their views of Alden Partridge, and the discussion about why they did that in a period of time, kind of almost reshaping history because of just the anger towards him. Is there any, based on your research and your discussions with historians and your process, have you found any Army historians or West Point historians amicable to maybe writing that book?
Not so far, no. So it's really not a conversation that's been brought up to say, hey, we kind of need to go back and correct this aspect. I think to some degree it's the original authors were highly biased against Partridge, so those have perpetuated, and then we have a series of, I would say, scholarly mistakes along the way, where scholars have misreported facts, and then it's kind of like a snowball of a mistold story that continues to this day. I don't know, maybe with my book it will spark some interest to go back and actually correct some historical records. Like Partridge, by and large, is more impactful than Thayer for education across the United States. So, one day West Point should throw up a statue of Partridge on campus, because ROTC will produce far more officers than West Point will ever in their history. So.
Anything else? Yes.
Sir, John Bull, class of 2019. What would you see as the mechanism of implementing or starting this change? Because like you talked about in a couple different instances, all the incentive structures currently are set against it. It makes more money to keep a student in school through 12th grade and then for 4 years of education and possibly a master's. It makes more money to have a standing army. And even if the federal government were to remove the incentive structures that led to those kinds of things, credentialism still has an appeal to the private sector of Harvard's Harvard, I'm going to pick the Harvard guy.
So I think you would have to do what Partridge did, which he walked into a field that wasn't developed at all. So it was used as a kind of a slight or install, but when his Middleton Academy was first started, they called it an infantile academy. They had no ability to grant degrees, yet people can. So I think that you'd really have to start this model, prove that it works, and then let the virtues or accomplishments of the students prove that, hey, this other model doesn't. Now, eventually, that one institution becomes 2 or 3, and then you could start talking about forming a credentialing body of the American system of education, and then reestablish a correct kind of credentialist model that truly supports the student versus the institution. So it would be a challenge. It would be a hard road to hoe, that's for sure.
You obviously think very strongly about this, that we're kind of going in the wrong direction. Is there a community among professionals? Are you a lone voice in the wilderness making this claim, or are you getting support? What kind of reception are you getting within?
So I think that there's a huge movement in society at large looking at, well, even political systems are starting to abandon credentialism, which is interesting because you just had Kamala Harris talk about ordering federal jobs to no longer assess degree requirements for hiring federal positions. So you'll start to see a collapse of, you'll have a kind of a big, huge university industrial model that no one will ask for. So what happens when all the job market says, we don't care about your degrees anymore? Will those universities exist? So I think we're at a tipping point where the universities realize, hey, we're becoming too expensive, we have to return back. And there are pockets, whether it's not necessarily inside the military, but are looking at changing kind of what the scope or level of education is. So like Jordan Peterson just started his kind of private academy. But I think you'll find kind of classical humanists try to restart what we used to think of as classical systems and through other ways. And the real burden of this is like, we have the most advanced technology we have today. Like, could you imagine if you took Partridge and like gave whatever, all the fancy electronic learning systems and tools we have into a Partridge model? It would be just insane. Like, we truly allow students to accelerate and kind of grow and be creative and create stuff along the way. Like, all our technology that we're developing would be far better inside this model than the model that we're using currently, because we're not accelerating students, not really helping them learn.